everyone, and welcome to this session on decarbonisation, approaches and challenges. My name is Travis Moore and I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Property, Construction and Project Management at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. I'm also a trustee with the Fuel Poverty Research Network. Today, I have a dual role in being the chair of this session, but also contributing as a panellist as well. The current panel discussion is focused around decarbonisation, and we will be exploring a number of different approaches, opportunities, but also some of the ongoing or new challenges to ensure that we can deliver decarbonisation to everyone in an equitable and just way. We know that some sectors are more difficult to decarbonise than others, and that there's going to be some similarities and differences in how we need to address this moving forward. But one of the key things is that we need to make sure we focus on those who are vulnerable and we're not leaving those people further behind. We have quite a varied panel here today, as you'll no doubt have seen through the presentations, and we're going to be covering some of these ideas around the technical, the commercial and the social challenges associated with these different approaches to decarbonisations. We have a panel who are representing different regions of the world. And so we should get some interesting insight into how some of these things are playing out across geographic locations. The panelists for this session are Rachael Malesh from Agility Eco, Matthew Scott from NEA, Raslan from UCL, Siddharth Serene from University of Stavanger, Rottmann from Users TCP by IEA, and myself from RMIT University. I'll shortly invite the panelists to talk for 2 to 3 minutes about the key messages from their presentations and focusing on the key takeaway learnings that they'll want to continue to discuss in the presentation. Following this, we're going to have a discussion with a Q&A, so please make sure that you put your questions down and we will draw on those questions when we come to the discussion time. So I'll hand over to Richard to introduce himself and to talk briefly about his presentation.
Thank you, Travis. Good morning, everyone. Richard Malesh. I was a civil servant in the UK for around 40 years, working in the last part of that time on energy efficiency and fuel poverty. In the last 2 years since I left, I've been working for Agility Eco, who provide a range of services to fuel poor, low income and vulnerable households, whether that's providing advice on debt, doing safety checks, helping with switching, or the more fundamental work around installing energy efficiency measures. So it's a sort of holistic approach. If you've seen our video, we had 2 themes to it. There was an overarching one, which was, I hope, understanding of the need to decarbonise and the importance of low carbon heat, but also raising questions around some of the big decisions that need to be taken on the balance in the UK certainly, but probably everywhere, around how you move to low carbon heat. What's the role of hydrogen? What's the role of electrification? Is it going to be a mixture of the two, or other greenhouse gases, other gases, low carbon gases? And how do you resolve all of that? And our conclusion is that there's a lot more work to be done, a lot more whole energy system modelling to be worked through. And in the meantime, you have to make sure that the people on low incomes, the vulnerable, can still keep their homes warm, that if they face a heat emergency where their boilers packed up, that they get the heat restored quickly. And we think that means some limited ongoing role for gas heating, repair and maintenance of repair and replacement of existing boilers, just for a small period of time until some of these bigger issues are resolved. Possibly there'll be a big role for hydrogen-ready boilers as well, but we'll see on that one. And the second theme was something much more specific around the importance of time of use tariffs to balance what will be increased electrification on the system, and how you make sure that the downsides of time of use tariffs for low income households are managed, and so that those risks are reduced and the benefits of time of use tariffs are realised for those households. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Richard. And yes, has will no doubt unpick some really interesting themes there and some questions around, when we're moving forward, what is the role for some of these existing systems still? All right, Matthew Scott from NEA.
Thanks, Travis, and thank you firstly for the invitation to be on this panel to the Fuel Poverty Research Network and to the organisers. The topic of my 2-minute presentation is a small but important piece of the decarbonisation puzzle, that which is usually termed disruption. My starting point here is that decarbonising domestic heat is going to require people to make infrastructural changes inside their homes that will fundamentally change the way that they interact with energy in their everyday lives. For households that struggle to access affordable warmth, we're concerned that these changes may be unduly disruptive and, if managed poorly, could exacerbate rather than alleviate the depth and severity of energy poverty and fuel poverty in the UK. Now, disruption is typically talked about in quite a specific way, at least in the UK context. This is something we could term consumer disruption. Now, in this conception, consumers live their lives and heat their homes in relatively stable and homogeneous ways. This stability, this kind of status quo that is seen as something that needs to be protected and sort of insulated from decarbonisation at all costs. And the upshot of that is that low carbon heating interventions, whether heat pumps or hydrogen, tend to be envisaged in terms of the extent to which they will disrupt this status quo, whether through the ripping up of floorboards to install new pipes or the installation of different systems in different parts of the home, including outside and sometimes in the case of heat pumps. But our point of view on this is more that for energy poor households, that status quo, that thing that disruption seeks to protect, is always unacceptable to start with. For these households, it's not enough to talk about minimising disruption. We actively need to be trying to use the decarbonisation of heat as a mechanism through which we can deliver real tangible benefits to households living in energy poverty. Now, NEA's ongoing research points to the ways that this can be done, and very briefly, one of the outcomes that our ongoing research is starting to show is that regardless of what technology or combination of technologies is used to decarbonise a domestic property, just how successful that tends to be is largely dependent on the level of advice and support that is given to households in order for them to understand how best to use the new technology. So some of this research is showing that multiple visits for advice at different points along the installation process are absolutely crucial and really help to cement information for energy poor households and vulnerable households about how to use their heating systems properly. In a more recent piece of ongoing research, the presence of wraparound advice and support alongside low carbon heating systems, particularly heat pumps, was viewed by delivery organisations as absolutely critical to their success, whereas delivery organisations that don't have that support included perceive some of their outcomes to be a little bit more limited. So I'll just end by touching briefly on what we think this means. I think broadly it is necessary but not sufficient to fund the full capital costs of low carbon heating systems for energy poor households. We also need to be having funding mechanisms for wraparound care, advice and support at different points of the installation process, or what we could call the customer journey, to ensure that vulnerable households understand how to use their new heating systems properly. And we think there's a role for absolutely everyone here. We think there's a role for manufacturers, for installers, for energy advice services, and we think that it's one of the ways that can not only serve to minimise disruption, however we might define disruption, but also transform it in a way that energy poor households can benefit sooner, faster from the decarbonisation of domestic heat. I'll leave it there. I've probably just gone over 3 minutes, but yeah, that's us.
Thanks, Matthew. And again, really, I guess, interesting to hear, the link there between some of these technical solutions and the additional kind of social support that needs to be put around these things. And, the idea of disruption is certainly one that, from the Australian context, we don't really think about that too much. So thank you for that. Rachael Raslan from UCL.
Good morning and thank you, Travis. My name is Rachael Raslan and I'm an associate professor at UCL IEDE. Over the past year or so, I've been working with Amy Ambrose from Cressa on developing an area of work that looks at the potential of hard to decarbonise homes as a pathway to energy equity. The research in this area came about as a result of analysis work I was involved with for the CCC, which involved both their net zero report and the UK 6 carbon budget. A lot of people ask me what hard to decarbonise homes are. They are simply homes where the reduction of carbon emissions is difficult to achieve. This is because they cannot be brought up to an appropriate standard of energy efficiency with currently available cost-effective measures. And the point about cost effectiveness is key. We don't know much about them, but we do know that they can make up a substantial proportion of the stock. Anywhere up to about 20% of UK homes have what we consider to be hard to decarbonise features. To put that in numbers, that's about 5 million homes. Despite the issue of cost effectiveness, we believe that tackling hard to decarbonise homes is important for a number of reasons. The most important is because of the people who live in them. They are key for energy equity because they are considered the hardest and least cost-effective houses to retrofit. But failing to tackle them means we are failing the most vulnerable households in society. To implement an effective strategy for the sector, we first need to look into addressing some key knowledge gaps that currently exist. This includes a very limited understanding of physical and locational attributes that make a home hard to decarbonise. So we know some, but we don't know everything. And more importantly, the occupant attributes that describe the people who live in them. So their socioeconomic and behavioural characteristics, their habits and routines on how they deal with these hard to decarbonise homes now. So our presentation focuses on how we plan to look at the occupant element of this research and how we plan to integrate it with the modelling work, where I kind of come in. So in regards to occupants, to address this, we believe we need an extensive programme of research in this area. So we're planning to undertake, hopefully, an extensive programme of qualitative interviews across different hard to decarbonise archetypes, which we'll identify across the UK. And we'll do this to gain insight on how occupants behave and interact with their home. And to do this, we plan to apply techniques which were recently used in some of the work that other panellists will probably discuss in terms of hard to reach energy users. We'll use the interviews to develop personas, which will go into the modelling work that I will hopefully lead. Because our modelling tools currently don't have profiles that are properly reflective of occupants, let alone people who live in these very specific circumstances as well. So we have standardised behavioural assumptions in there that won't do for people who live in hard to decarbonise homes. The third and fourth actions of our research really involve engaging with stakeholders and interested parties, because we really have to get interest in this area going. So we plan to co-produce some regionally focused hard to decarbonise scenarios for key regions around the UK where clusters of these homes are located. And this will help formulate local strategy and targets, but also we hope to get feedback from interested parties from a wider group. So we plan to create a hard to decarbonise energy equity network to bring together relevant policy and research stakeholders in this area. So briefly, we think the impact of this work is significant because over the next few years, our housing stock will be upgraded as part of our aim to reach net zero and as part of sort of the green economic recovery. But without our work, we believe that hard to decarbonise homes will either not be tackled at all because people don't know how to deal with them, or tackled in a way that is not meaningful for those who live in them. So our work therefore aims to ensure that the drive for energy efficiency is done in a way that supports energy equity and to ensure that no one gets left behind. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Again, a really interesting issue. And when you put the numbers around it, around 20% or 5 million dwellings that this is likely to be impacting, it kind of really highlights the scale of the challenge. And I know that the number of dwellings in the UK is a lot more than in places like Australia or even New Zealand. But it highlights a really significant challenge that we're going to need to focus on moving forward. All right, so Siddharth Serene from University of Stavanger, who is on the move somewhere, but over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry about being on the go. On the plus side, you get to see a view of the Western Norwegian fjords as I talk. So the work that I've referred to in the video and what I want to say a couple of things about is really around the massive acceleration of rollout of solar photovoltaics over the past 5-10 years. And a couple of things I want to emphasize is the first pertains to the political economy of the sector. It's been a shift change in the last 5 years from solar being something that's seen as needing subsidies. A lot of my work has been in Portugal, some in Western India, and I remember, we had the Secretary of State for Energy talking at this conference yesterday. I remember talking with people in the ministry there in 2017 and developers saying there's no way it's going to work without feed-in tariffs, without some kind of ability to access capital. That's changed in the last couple of years. It's just shot up. There's been really successful solar auctions. Technology price has gone down 90-odd%. So this is not new. What it means is that it does shift the ways in which one can negotiate the decarbonization of the energy sector, of that primary source, the pieces of the puzzle that it can fit in as. And I want to say a couple of things about those, especially emphasizing scale. A lot of the growth that we have seen has been at the large scale. There's a couple of exceptions, actually. Countries like Brazil, like Australia, have shown quite a lot of household and community scale adoption as well. But we risk also in Portugal seeing a lot of hundreds of megawatts, even gigawatts in places like China and India, solar plants coming up, while we leave behind a lot of the middle, low-income households that could really benefit from the modular nature of this sort of technology, also from the kind of gains in energy flexibility as we move towards being able to have electric bicycles, being able to use flexibility with small batteries that are becoming increasingly affordable at the household scale. So a couple of exciting things around that. We're going to, as a Horizon 2020 project, actually install community energy schemes in a bunch of cities around Europe, emulating what New York has done in Brooklyn, where it allows for, instead of energy efficiency subsidies to vulnerable households in energy poverty, that allows for virtual solar energy consumption at a subsidized rate for those households. So this is one way that you can make solar energy something that's more widely beneficial. Community energy legislation which has come up in countries also for energy cooperatives, to people who live as tenants, who lack access to their own roof, who might want to do something collectively at the block level to be part of a solar shift. And I think that's a key thing to consider, how it fits into different sectors, so that it's part of a broader decarbonization shift, and how it is actually a rollout that happens at multiple scales simultaneously, so that it's not just led by incumbents, it's not led by large companies. It's something that there is common ownership of, public ownership of, both by the public sector, but also by households that are well below the middle class and also the energy poor, because increasingly this will be a piece of the puzzle that gets impossible for governments to ignore. And the more that actors like cities embrace it, the more it becomes easier for others to point to successful examples that work. So I'll keep it there for now. Just end with saying there's a couple of PhD vacancies out in the group to look at accountable solar energy transitions. So I really hope you spread the word. And there's, I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks for that. Again, this really interesting analysis around the role of scale and the opportunities there. I think in terms of when we're talking about households, we have seen countries where quite a high uptake of residential solar and the benefits going directly to the household. But there's questions there around the efficiency around that, the economics around that. But then if you start to go to those solar farms and larger scales and those types of things, what are the benefits for those who are vulnerable, who can't afford to access, or as places like Australia are now seeing, we're having parts of the network locked out because there's too much solar in some locations. So those who haven't yet got onto it are further left behind. See you, Rottmann.
Kia ora, from the future. It's a warm summer's night in New Zealand at about 11 o'clock at night, so I'll try and keep my brain switched on. Thank you so much for inviting me as well. I guess what I'm representing is a much more broad perspective, international perspective, from an international research collaboration under the Users TCP by the International Energy Agency that I've been leading for 9 years, and we focused on behavior, 10 years now almost. We focused on behavior change in demand side management at first, and really realized that it was very important to actually not just look at the people whose behavior we tried to change, but also the so-called behavior changers, which is all of us who are designing and piloting and implementing various policies, programs, and projects, and how to incorporate all of them with the varying mandates and the energy users as well. And what came out during this project was that we very often focus on the intervention strategies or the engagement strategies first before we really have done enough of that kind of multi-stakeholder collaboration, but also enough research, really understanding and targeting the energy users and the target behaviors that we really want to focus on. And when we did some of that work with pilots, we found that there is definitely a group of energy users that is harder to reach than others. We thought quite idiotically now in hindsight that it was about 30% of energy users in the world, and we followed a strategic research design process that we kind of created some building blocks on behavior change. And so the first year and a half of our project is very much focused on the stakeholder and landscape assessment and doing a really in-depth characterization of how to reach energy users. Accidentally wrote an ebook in lockdown with 250 pages, just delving really deeply into those kind of hard to reach and vulnerable households, and finding out that it is probably more like 2/3, maybe 3/4 of energy users in the world who would fall under that category. Especially with COVID, it's got even bigger. It involves way more than just vulnerable households. There is a huge amount of these energy users in the commercial sectors. The 99% of all businesses in the world are in the small to medium enterprise kind of size. A lot of them are actually running out of their households. We have no idea how many. There's a whole lot of overlap and intersectionalities around various vulnerabilities of these energy users. We have not done enough research on their demographics, on their psychographics, on their needs. We're a lot better at like studying the barriers, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that we're kind of maybe still not really researching enough. And one of the things that we found when we brought the countries together to figure out what our shared goal is that equity is very much sitting in this kind of Venn diagram that everyone thinks is kind of one of the most important things that we need to tackle, but it is a lot harder to actually deal with the underlying structural issues of inequity and energy injustice. And once you when I start talking about, colonialism and slavery and, structural racism and all these things that have caused, misogyny, I don't know. There's a whole lot of isms that have caused a whole lot of problems that are very structural and very inbred. And if we go straight to the solutions, especially if they're very technology focused, we often kind of ignore that there is a whole giant world behind that is actually, or even financial, solutions that is not actually going to overcome the barriers that these very vast number of energy users are facing. And so some of what we may need to do is also change the behavior of the behavior changers, as we call them, which is all of us, and maybe try and figure out how we can actually deal with some of those big, really messy, hard, complex questions and issues where we need to go way beyond just the research area and really engage with a whole lot of other sectors and behavior changes as well. And one of the big things, other than the issue around the structural issues of inequity that really came out, I think, with COVID, is the issue of stigma, and particularly what stigma does to those households who may not have been in vulnerable circumstances until they were furloughed or lost their jobs, or had to run their business out of their home, and they weren't able to get the kids in school, or their key essential workers, etc., etc. And suddenly they may have, they may still have a strong asset base and be classed like middle class or medium income, but they actually find themselves not being able to pay their bills anymore, and suddenly dealing with the stigma of being in this situation and with a welfare system that is often very cruel, etc., is actually quite a big problem that I think is just going to get larger and larger. And that's another area that I don't think we can ignore, or we ignore at our peril, especially if we go straight to like technological or financial or policy solutions, which is what we're all comfortable with. So I think I leave it as that. I think the main thing that I just want to kind of keep noting is that the energy sector and energy efficiency has had a very white middle class, often male perspective in its approach. It's very economic, very engineering focused. And I think we really need to bring the rest of the world along with us there, or actually, maybe shut up and learn first. I don't know. Sorry.
Thanks for that, C. I don't think you're alone in perhaps underestimating the extent of those hard to reach cohorts. Certainly depending on your definition there as well. But in your presentation, you did touch on some of those cohorts that might be a bit easier to reach, or have some of those larger gains, like the landlords. So it was good to see that in that presentation it wasn't just all bad news. There was some kind of good news there and some positive things to think about that when we're moving forward. Okay, so now I'm just going to quickly talk about the presentation that I was involved with some colleagues, Becky Sharp from the state government in Victoria and Ian Adams from Organic Engineering. And what we talked about in the presentation was an evaluation of some low energy houses that were built for public housing in Victoria almost a decade ago. And at the time they were built to a 9-star standard. So in Australia we have a 10-star standard, with 10 being the best, 0 being the worst. The easiest equivalent I could say for those 9-star houses is probably around a passive house type standard. And at the time they were being designed and built, minimum standards in Victoria and in Australia were 5 and then 6-star, and we remain at 6-star now. They were that innovative that we're still seeing less than 0.5% of new housing reach that similar performance standard, even 10 years later. So still quite good performing buildings. We evaluated those in terms of the technical and social performance, and as expected, they performed quite well. Reduced energy consumption, improved thermal comfort, improved occupant health and well-being. These were houses that didn't have air conditioning and coped very well during some really extreme summer conditions. What the state government was able to do is to draw upon this data and research into some of their other projects and to revise their own internal building standards, which were at the time already above minimum standards, but they've lifted those even further. So the minimum standards are now 1-star above minimum for the general public new housing, and there's a range of other requirements that have been introduced in recent years, such as the use of Green Star tools for higher density housing as well. There's really been a significant shift as well towards an all-electric requirement for housing based upon sustainability, affordability, and occupant health and wellbeing outcomes. So that's been quite a significant shift, and we're seeing that kind of rapid scaling up of the all-electric idea for housing in Australia. Recently, the state government has announced some quite significant funding for both a regeneration of public and social housing in Victoria, but also to be able to deliver that public housing to a higher performance standard as well. And so that's really going to help bring that sort of sustainable, affordable, low carbon housing to some of those who need it most. So it's really good to see that recent announcement there as well. I guess there is the kind of the ongoing discussions around, where there are additional costs for these things, how do public housing providers balance any additional cost against the need to provide more housing? And I think that, that's an interesting discussion that's still playing out. It's good to see those steps towards improving sustainability. And what we see is that, the public and social housing providers in Australia really have a significant opportunity to try and lead the market through their economies of scale. And one of the key things, just to finish up on, is the importance of the detailed monitoring and the Internet of Things that we had in some of this evaluation here, where we were able to pick up things when they weren't working. So instances of the solar panels, for example, not working, picking them up much more quickly. And when you're talking about people in vulnerable households and reliance on some of that technology, if the technology isn't working properly, it can be quite a long time until they or somebody else picks it up. So we need to make sure that we think about those things moving forward. All right, I will leave that there and I will now open it up to the discussions. Let me just have a look here to have a look. Okay, a question for Siddharth. Can we hear more about the pros and cons of centralised versus decentralised approaches for PV, and how do we control the spread of gigaplants?
Can you give me? Sure. So, great question. Thanks, Simi. I don't think we can control the spread necessarily. I think that there's ways of being able to think about plans for growing the transmission grid network, where we do that. That can have some implications for where sort of centralized large-scale plants come up, and there is some scope for those in a rapid decarbonization scenario that one would think of as desirable. But certainly, a big part of it has to be decentralized in terms of producing energy close to where it's going to be consumed, where there can be short-term storage options, where they can be sold to others. And so in Europe, for instance, there's a plan to have 100 positive energy districts, and we have a cost action, so a large network that's running kind of like Engager, but that just kicked off last year. That's looking at how to enable these, how to learn from particular efforts at the block level now. And I think a lot of it has to do with identifying, even though most of the work has been on techno-economic models, and we need more and more of a focus on governance and how to push for political economic solutions that address energy poverty alleviation, that address social justice concerns. I think that there is a need for some techno-economic models that work for community energy, that work for decentralized solutions to actually benefit the stakeholders who can be part of rolling them out. What we see, unfortunately, is a lot of these solutions being held back. Just having legislation in place that makes them a non-starter or doesn't reward people adequately if you can't self-consume, and leaves behind households that don't have flexibility in their energy use, which is typically ones that are on the lower income scale as well. So I think those are some of the main points I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, thanks for that. And there's, I guess, another question here, which you might be able to touch on as well, but also I'm sure there'll be some thoughts across the panel around this idea of if it is cheaper to kind of deliver those larger scale solar plants or renewable energy plants rather than doing individual household renewable energy systems, is it perhaps not better to be able to put more of the funding into those largest plants and figuring out some better financial mechanisms to help those lower income or vulnerable households, either through, it says here, free kilowatt hours per user or some sort of reduction in cost there?
Maybe I can say a couple of quick things. I'm sure others have thoughts here. So two, one, if you see operators like, IKEA is a good example, there's possibilities for people to access those economies of scale by having a large scale procurement and then being able to make it available for rollout at smaller scales like the household rooftop communities. So there's no reason why it can't be. It's so competitive. It's more competitive than pretty much any other energy source out there in many contexts already. It's certainly feasible for it to still work at the decentralized scale. And the second bit of it there is that now I'm losing my train of thought here. Sorry, we're in motion, but I can pass on if anybody else wants to chip in.
Richard, did you have any thoughts on this? Anyone else? It's I guess from my perspective,
maybe can I just chip in? Sorry. Just that that costing is a bit tricky, because what are we actually talking about as the total cost? Are we talking also about the transmission grid networks that have a huge embodied carbon emissions cost? There's a lot of concrete, there's a lot of metal in there. There's and there's complexities of land use as well. So if we calculate those things, then I think it's very difficult to make an argument against decentralized solar in terms of the total costs, also social costs and carbon costs.
Yeah, and certainly when you look at the different outcomes, I guess, in terms of the individual household getting the benefit directly in terms of the energy bills and being able to regulate when they use certain appliances and those types of things, if they're able to, compared to if you're just buying it like green energy, it becomes challenging. This one is directed to you, C, but I suspect that a few others will be able to jump in on this one. You've highlighted the issue of the lack of diversity amongst program design, and clearly if we put white middle class males in, we get the same things out. No wonder so many groups are hard to reach, but that culture will take time to change. What can we do in the interim to make energy initiatives more inclusive? So yeah, cool. It's a nice easy one for you to answer.
There's nothing wrong with white middle class males, by the way. I'm going to marry one of them very soon. But it's just that, obviously, like with anything, when there is one perspective that is, consistently stronger and in charge of designing the things that are the rules and the structures and the interventions, not necessarily based on a clear understanding of the needs and the characteristics of the people you're trying to change with those interventions, you know, get to 40 years of energy efficiency being the greatest market value of all time, even though we all know it makes the most sense out of anything. So I think some of the ways that we can deal with some of these issues right now are exactly around the things that I was saying. We need to stop operating in silos. We need to stop starting with the intervention design or with the engagement strategy, and instead do some more work with each other, first figuring out what all the different perspectives are, very much engaging the energy end users themselves, and work on like how we can co-create with trusted middle actors in the community who are having a much greater way of speaking their language and understanding the cultural issues, who can actually help translate some of that stuff and teach us some of the things that we need to learn, because those people who are in vulnerable circumstances do not have the time, energy, or inclination to spend all their time teaching us white middle class folk, and not all of us are that, of course, but you know, it needs to be acknowledged that we do need to actually decolonize our minds quite strongly and fast, and figure out how to do that in co-creation with the people that we are so desperately trying to take along with us and try and change. And that's the people who are in that behavior changer area, the program designers, the policy, people, the researchers, the community groups who are designing bottom-up strategies, but then also how to actually co-create participatory action research with the people who we're trying to change, and make them feel like they're actually being heard and they're being taken along. And I do believe that well-designed and evaluated pilots that show that it can be done is the way forward. And, that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to create a standardized, internationally validated way of how we can actually do this, so we don't forget about the really important bits when we get super excited about a technology, about a policy, financial strategy, or some kind of, business model or something, because there's always something new that sounds super exciting to people like us that we leave the rest of the world behind sometimes. Sorry, that was a long answer.
That was interesting. And Matthew, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to this. It seemed like in your presentation you were talking about some of the things that had been put in place for some of the programs in terms of that additional support and working with people there in a lot more hands-on way. Is there anything there around some of those innovations that you can talk to?
I think, excuse me, not so much about this issue of kind of inclusivity by design. I think C's absolutely right to talk about this as a much broader structural issue that's difficult to tackle in the interim, and that's going to be difficult to tackle without broader structural change. I think one of the things we can do in the interim, and it's not as related to the question, is that we can sort of reflect on our own practice, and particularly when we put and speak at events like this, we can try and do our best to make sure that events like this are inclusive and that bring different voices to the fore, that wherever sort of feasible and possible, we have things like sign language and sort of captions that make these events more accessible and make them, include a diverse range of speakers to the most, to the greatest extent we can. And I think that sort of amplifying those voices as much as possible and sort of doing our bit in these kind of forums is one of the small things that we can do. So not so much on the design of programs specifically, but I think looking across the different work that we all do as researchers and that we all do as practitioners, there's different angles that we can sort of work at in the interim as we sort of figure out that very thorny issue of that broader structural change that, I don't think I have any answers to, and I don't think, I think if we did have answers, we would, we would hopefully be doing it already.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Next question here for Rachael. What is the relationship between the hard to decarbonise and hard to reach cohorts, and how can we ensure that the hard to reach households are engaged in finding user-friendly solutions to hard to decarbonise homes?
Well, I'm really glad that both C and Matthew spoke before about this topic before the question got to me, because they've provided a lot of the answers to what I was going to say. The relationship between hard to decarbonise and hard to reach energy users is one that's fundamentally quite important, because, like I mentioned, there are three main things that make a house hard to decarbonise. Physical attributes of the house, where it is located. So if it's hard to get into, if it's in an exposed location, which makes it hard for us to insulate, for example, if it's off the gas grid. But most importantly, the people who live in there, and a good proportion of the people who live in hard to decarbonise homes are either fuel poor or for various reasons hard to reach. And we're hoping that through the research to engage with people like C to really familiarise with the techniques that she mentioned and how to engage with them through, for example, intermediaries within the community, participatory approaches to co-production, as was mentioned in the chat. There are various approaches that I think we could bring into to find solutions that actually work with them. And Richard's presentation touched on why it's really important to talk to these people, because his presentation was about time of use tariffs. And he touched on an important issue where time of use tariffs might not be all that appropriate for people who are trying to heat their homes and would otherwise be left out in the cold. So a solution like that would seem to be a no-brainer for a normal energy user. But what about someone who's more vulnerable? So really engaging with these communities via the ways that C mentioned and looking at sort of the wider scope that Matthew mentioned, I think is the key to doing this. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to add to that. When you are looking at hard to reach homes, and some of the things that you just set out there as to what makes a home hard to reach, look here. What it comes down to in the end is cost, because they're the worst homes. And the people in them probably require the most support. So you have to spend quite a lot of money getting the homes up to speed. And because they are fuel poor and other low income households that we're talking about here, then they're not going to have the money to afford a new boiler, a new heat pump, to afford a lot of energy efficiency work. So this is sort of where you get down to the nitty gritty, because you're relying on government programs to provide the support to a large extent for these people. As we all know, government spending in any area is finite. So this is why I sort of come back to this hard trade-off between how fast of progress you make on decarbonisation and reaching in the UK the net zero targets, and the extent to which you're not penalising fuel poor people. And I think that's a lot of where our thinking comes around. And the point on time of use tariffs was we actually get the fact that they could play an important role in balancing increased electrification on the system, so you're matching supply and demand. But there are great potential advantages for people in fuel poverty from time of use tariffs, and they should not be left out simply because they can't take advantage of the technology that you need to support time of use tariffs and other things like that. But you need to do quite a few things in the way you design those sort of tariffs or any other components of the energy system to make sure that people are able to take advantage of developments, even if they're on low income or they're elderly or they're infirm.
Yeah, and I guess just picking up on those kind of last couple of points there, the question of cost and those hard to decarbonise type of houses, and this is a discussion that I have every now and then with some colleagues in Melbourne, is we don't really have a good understanding, certainly in the Australian context, of when you need to draw the line at some of those places and you just say, you can't do anything more, and perhaps a knockdown rebuild is a better opportunity. I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel has any thoughts on, are we doing enough thinking around that, particularly for the hard to decarbonise kind of houses? Like, what role is that kind of knockdown rebuild going to play there?
Can I offer an opinion? So I think we need to look at what we mean by cost effective and look at what we kind of include in that calculation, if I can be very kind of be broad about it. Our current definition of cost effective is somewhat limiting. There are two ways to address that: either making technologies cost effective some way through production or whatever, or looking at redefining what we mean by cost effective by including a wider range of elements in there. Then I think there will be sort of a redressing of that balance. So are we looking at health impacts as part of that equation? We probably aren't currently doing it enough. Are we looking at social benefits? So bringing all these things into that equation will kind of hopefully move what we consider to be cost effective, in addition to technological kind of innovation that will also play its part. And in terms of rebuild and reuse, I think there will always be a role for rebuilding, reusing. We do a lot of work from that perspective and sort of looking at community participation, LCA, and how to kind of make that decision. Do we keep or do we knock down and rebuild? But in the UK, and I'm sure around the world, people are emotionally attached to their housing stock. We very rarely knock down houses. In some way, we prize how old and how can I say, how characterful some of our houses are. The turnover rate is very, very small. It's not like the commercial sector. So even though I think rebuilding houses will be part of it, I think we have to also look at what this community values, and it seems to be that for a long time we will have to be working with what we have for a number of reasons. It won't be just about sort of the energy efficiency and how to improve it.
Yeah, great. Matthew, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on this question of cost effectiveness, and I absolutely agree that I think connecting the cost of effectiveness of sort of energy interventions and housing interventions like this to other domains such as health and also such as education are really important, and something that needs to be a little bit more centrally part of the conversation, and that we know that cold homes contribute directly to respiratory conditions, to musculoskeletal conditions, circulatory conditions. And we know that if we deal with those issues early, we don't just make those conditions better, we prevent them later down the line as well. So if you have an intervention in a home with a small child who is more likely to develop asthma, if that home is cold, you're preventing issues down the line. And if the cost of preventing those issues to health services is factored in, that cost potentially becomes less, the cost effectiveness becomes greater. And I think there's also now kind of sort of limited but growing evidence on the links between energy poverty and educational attainment. There's some links between energy poverty and sort of lower motivation, task persistence. And there's also, as we've seen with COVID, there's a real link between, if you live in a cold home, can you do your schoolwork at home? So I think broadening this conversation of the benefits of decarbonising homes in a fair way that makes them warm. I think if we can be better as researchers, as practitioners, and engaging with policy on connecting up all of these different issues and getting more stakeholders from these different domains in the rooms together, we can maybe do that a little bit better, and we can maybe make the case a little bit better that these interventions are cost effective, however we define that.
Yeah, really some good insights there, I think, into that cost debate still and what still needs to be unpicked. C, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, I just want to give a big shout out to the multiple co-benefits of decarbonisation and energy efficiency. Obviously, in New Zealand, we've done a lot of work around the macroeconomic health impacts in particular, because we have one of the absolute most unhealthy housing stock in the world, definitely in the OECD. And we found that even with a simple insulation subsidy program, which wasn't very targeted at all, the macroeconomic health benefits were like something like $5 to every dollar spent on insulation. So definitely that is something that we need to do much better at, and especially figuring out the matrix, how we can evaluate, particularly for the soft benefits that are often not acknowledged, but that are really, really, really important. And a couple of questions that have been raised in the chat that I want to kind of just touch on a little bit here is because when we get too excited about co-benefits or multiple benefits, we kind of ignore the fact that there is very often a lot of costs and impacts involved for, particularly the most vulnerable or hardest to reach households or energy users. And that's where, we can run into some of these barriers and these perverse outcomes where, you know, it actually causes more stress, or it's completely, you know, not targeted at renters, or it's, potentially actually getting them into strife with the landlords or whatever. There's 100 million barriers that would kind of push them away even more. And so, yeah, I think we just need to do a lot. This is another gap that we definitely found in our research, where we just need to do a lot more work on. And that's something that all of us can do if we start including it in how we evaluate our programs and how we choose the metrics. So I think, yeah.
Siddharth, did you have something you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, sorry, we're going through a few mountains here. I might drop out, but I wanted to say that it's important to all the rules that have been made to not lose sight of the supply side opportunities here that have, from a systemic perspective, to also be taken along. So where do you build manufacturing capacity? What sort of thing? How do you have public procurement standards that encourage not just building renovation, energy efficiency equipment, renewable equipment in places that then need to be flown halfway across the world or shipped, which again, like, comes into life cycle questions, and how can it be something that's also valuable in terms of generating benefits that, again, are not to slip into the danger of localism, but that really help different parts of the world all contribute to a transition, and not then lead to having waste pile up somewhere else, having the burden of extraction be borne by places far away. And I think that's also an important aspect of justice, of translocal justice, that we have to keep in mind, along with the household level issues and the kind of stuff that energy poverty draws our attention.
Yeah, and I think that issue around supply chains is a really important one, particularly for, you know, places like New Zealand and Australia. With this global kind of lockdown and pandemic, we're realizing how reliant we are on things from other parts of the world, which is being problematic. Richard?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the questions I've seen. One was, why do we target low-income households for low-carbon interventions when they're not using enough heat and energy as it is, which is a really good question. But I think the point is that we're not targeting them so that they use less heat. We're targeting them so they can afford to use more and they have a warmer and more comfortable home. I think that has to be the way forward. But it does add another element of complexity to the trade-off between saving carbon and not penalising people on low incomes and in fuel poverty, because you're intervening, but you're not gaining the carbon savings that you might do if you focus, for instance, more on the people who could afford to contribute to the costs. So there's another challenge here. And the second thing I was picking up on was a question about what you do to try and reach people who are hard to reach. I think that's going back to the point about working locally rather than centrally, having trusted local partners, maybe in ethnic minority groups, having people who are local champions, who are trusted. So you want those sort of partnerships, and you want what Matthew's been talking about as well, which is not just as has happened here quite a bit, people banging on doors saying, we're in the area, we're installing whatever energy efficiency measure it is, would you like to have it? It could be free for you. People not being quite sure what they're getting, but a much more holistic intervention where people are given support, it's explained to them what these measures are, and they get the sort of multiple measures installed that government's now talking about in order to move people up several energy efficiency ratings rather than just simply sticking in one measure. So that was just to pick up on a couple of the questions.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge in many parts of the world, is that these programs to support certain retrofit activities then have a flood of that type of activity, and you get the people knocking on the door doing the light bulbs for free or whatever it might be. And some things like light bulbs obviously are fairly self-explanatory, or should be. But some of those more tricky technologies, if people don't know how to use them or have that check-in again that kind of Matthew was talking about to kind of guide them, it can be quite problematic. And certainly that's what we noticed in the case study that I presented in earlier on, was that kind of engagement with the households kind of helped them. And not too many of them looked at the user manual that they were given when they moved into the house, but it was those discussions with people kind of ongoing. And so the role of the social housing provider, the officer who might go out to the house from time to time and do checks, and making sure that they have the knowledge to be able to pick up on some of these things, I think is really important. I just wanted to also pick up on the fact that I guess we've been talking quite a lot about some of the heating elements here as well, but there are increasing issues around cooling as well. Perhaps not in Australia this summer. We certainly didn't have the summer that we had the year before, but the challenges around cooling, some of them are linked to the heating, and some of the solutions are going to be different. But I wondered if anyone had any specific points around that. We might be able to make sure we don't just focus on the heating, but we also focus on the cooling side of things.
Can I offer just a few comments on that? I think it's really, really important that we consider both needs, because even in heating dominant countries such as the UK, we're seeing cooling becoming more of a feature during summers, believe it or not. And one of the ways we can do that is when we design these solutions, we make sure that they're future fit, that they are able to provide the level of comfort that is required now, both heating and some cooling, and also design them in such a way that they do not lead to unintended consequences in terms of an increased demand for cooling if we can help it, or even if the trend is going that way because of global warming, to build into our designs sort of a provision for increased temperatures going forward. So one of the ways we're doing that is by having sort of a future fit approach to designing solutions. And I've just seen a comment about how we're told to consume less energy and how this is a damaging message. Can I also respond to that very quickly? I think the message should be redressed. I think it should be something along the lines of your house should use or consume less energy to keep you comfortable, either way, heating or cooling. So yes, I think maybe the message should be changed a little to communicate the intention of what we want to do.
Thanks. C?
Yeah, I definitely want to just totally agree with the importance of cooling and how much more that comes up, particularly in the global south. We did look a little bit at that in our literature review and found that it also can create a whole lot of extra issues for households who used to be in winter energy bill issues and get like winter energy payments or something, and suddenly they also actually have a summer energy issue when they're using the efficient heat pumps that the government pushed on them to like start cooling their homes because they need to. So there's a whole extra potential for obviously a huge overload on the grid with summer peaks, but also of crowding out those vulnerable households or have them suffer detrimental health effects if they can't cool their houses in the same way. And I really want to pick up on the two questions around the high energy users and the energy profligate, because particularly Sweden, who is one of our participating countries, is very interested in them because they have the lowest rate of fuel poverty in the world. And so they're like, we're much more interested in the high consumers. And so we started looking in our literature review, what's out there that really delves into these high consumer groups. And whoever said this is absolutely right. There is so much less research focusing on them. There is so many fewer programs focusing on them. There's so much less attention focusing on them. A big issue is, of course, that most countries do not have progressive energy pricing, which means that, like in a lot of countries, energy is still like very, very cheap, especially for those high consumers. And, we still live in a neoliberal overconsumption affluenza society. And so, they are a massively larger amount of the actual problem when you look at, the energy use and the carbon side of things, and they are not tackled or researched anywhere near to the extent as the fuel poor, the low income are. And, you know, sometimes the way we're tackling the fuel poor, the low income further stigmatizes them, even with the best of intentions. And so I think it's probably time to put some of that stigma and attention maybe on the very profligate energy users, you know, in the nicest possible way, and start figuring out, as I said, again, in those multi-stakeholder collaborations with policymakers, etc., how we can maybe start also with more progressive pricing schemes and stuff where, you know, and carbon pricing as well and stuff, where some of that overconsumption is actually being penalized a bit more, including societally, potentially, but also financially and by policy.
Siddharth?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that point. I think that there's also a risk of these elite consumers arbitraging the grid, having a lot of storage, being able to sell back during dynamic or time of use tariffs, and actively, in effect, raising the prices for more inflexible needs households, people who might be very much on the verge of in energy poverty. So I think one thing that we need to keep in mind is the need for regulations to keep up and almost sort of anticipate, whereas the situation we have now with smart grids, with the digitalization of the electricity sector and increasingly the electrification of other sectors like mobility, certainly in Norway, where the grid has been largely hydropower fed for a long time, we're seeing the big challenge now is decarbonization of mobility, which is one of the major contributors to emissions. The challenge there is of regulatory lag. How do you address that while innovation goes kind of on steroids? So I think there's certainly room for safeguards there, and that's a tricky one. When you talk to regulators, it's not, they want to be adaptive, they want to be responsive, but they also have to go through a certain set bureaucratic procedure, and there are good reasons for that as well. But there is a clear risk.
Yeah, thanks. And I can see Richard's keen to pick up on this as well.
Well, actually, I had a question for you, Travis, but I'll hold it back if you want to keep going with this topic.
No, that's fine. Continue.
So I was interested, you were talking about the importance of monitoring and whether the improvements that have been made to homes were effective or whether there were problems. I just wondered how far you took that. Was that around testing for the first homes done? Was it seen as a device through which if performance wasn't as expected, then the household would pay less? I mean, how far do you take that?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. And the question around, I guess, do you get what you're being promised in terms of a design or a performance certificate, particularly for new housing, and if it doesn't perform and you can demonstrate that through monitoring. Unfortunately, in the Australian context, there's really no recourse for challenging those types of things. They'll, if you do try to do it, it comes down to the assumptions within the models, and the assumptions are very vague and generic, and very easy, I guess, to point out why it won't match the kind of the performance design. In terms of the social housing, it was really critical in my thoughts on it, because what it did was it helped us to understand more quickly how the houses were performing, and also it did pick up some of those issues where the solar wasn't connected in one instance, and I think in another instance one of the panels on one of the systems stopped working, and so that was able to be picked up a lot more quickly than if you're waiting. You know, in Australia you could have a bill cycle of every 3 months for your electricity. If you don't pick it up on the first bill, you know, you could be going 6 months or more. And when you've got these households who, you know, across the year were $1,000 in credit because of the feed-in tariffs, these are low-income households who that $1,000 is critical. You know, it was changing their lives. They were able to buy Christmas presents for people. They were able to go on small little holidays. They were able to do things that most of us probably take for granted and don't even bat an eyelid at. But for those people, that additional money was critical. So if you take half of that away or more of it away because of the solar panels not working, you know, particularly because they had then experienced it, I think that's important. And if you're talking about maintenance, you know, public housing, social housing providers have quite quite large housing stocks in some instances, and it can help with that maintenance and upkeep, which I think is really important. Matthew, did you have something?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. I think it's a really interesting discussion around regulation with low carbon technology. I think the only two things I wanted to add, more as questions maybe than anything, is that there's discussion in the UK and I believe elsewhere about, do we need to start thinking about regulating heat and power instead of gas and electricity, and what that actually might mean for policy. And I think it's interesting. We talk about the kind of the policy apparatus and the consumer protections not keeping pace with some of the changes of decarbonisation. I think that's a really interesting question. But I think the second point is the kind of need for us to have appropriate redress mechanisms within lots of this, is that if things aren't going wrong, and particularly if they're going wrong for households that might not be as confident in engaging with the energy system or the energy market or talking to the suppliers or an ombudsman or whoever it might be, there's a real risk there that there starts to be a bit of a gap open up where you get households that have had a bad install for whatever reason and aren't sure who to go to rectify it or what rights they have. So I think there's a really interesting conversation to have around regulation and also what kinds of redress we might need and how that's sort of monitored and how it's ensured that it's kind of robust and effective going forwards.
Yeah, and I think that's really critical. What we saw in Australia a decade ago when we had a mass insulation rollout program kind of go wrong. Some people would argue, others might argue that it was pretty successful in the end in terms of what it was trying to do, but ultimately there were a number of deaths in the installation process and a number of house fires, which saw the program shut down pretty much overnight. And there is still a stigma in the industry and with households around insulation. And there's work now to try and address some of that in terms of how do you make sure people have confidence in their installers? How do we make sure people are following the right rules and regulations? But it does highlight the challenges. We're still trying to overcome that more than 10 years later. So if we get these things wrong, whether it's whole house performance, whether it's elements within it, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. There was a question here around, and it links to some of your stuff.
Can I just for a second jump in on this? As the Kiwi counterpart to that, because we had for once a bit of a win against Australia in that one, because our insulation program actually managed to do the opposite, because we are terrible in New Zealand at culturally just accepting the fact that Amy calls it the masculine pioneer culture, just accepting that the houses are freezing because our Scottish background, and we think we live in the South Pacific, but it's actually the sub-Antarctic, and there's a whole just put in another jump on and don't whinge about it kind of very cultural thing that our insulation program actually managed to kind of actually get rid of. So there is you can lose so much trust in the whole culture if something like this goes wrong. And this is why these kind of national policy programs, if you don't pilot them first and if you don't design them really well with that multi-stakeholder input, and particularly that end user view as well, then you can get to either you accidentally stumble across their health impacts and you manage to communicate it all around that, and you don't burn any houses down and it goes really good. And now New Zealanders finally go insulation is actually a good thing after 10 years. Or you have what you have in Australia where some of those things happened, and then you find yourself 10 years later still dealing with the cultural stigma that insulation is something bad. And that is where, and you saw it was in the UK as well, with your insulation programs, that bad policy design or hurried policy design with not enough input from the different perspectives can actually cause so much more problems than it's worth. And I really hope we can learn from these international examples and experiences and those horror stories, which we need to share. I think that's just really important. Sorry, I derailed it a bit. And sorry, Travis, you were going to another question.
No, I think it's all interesting. There was the question I was going to go to, it kind of links to this idea around some of this quality or defects issue to some degree, but it's around some of the things that you were talking about, Matthew, in terms of how do you make some of these retrofit experiences or programs that can be hugely, have a negative impact on the household while they're going on? Like, what are the opportunities, or how do we make those easier for the occupants?
It's a really good question, and I think despite the topic of the presentation I gave, I don't have all the answers to this. I think the one thing I would reiterate, and it's similar to a point that Richard's made previously, is that working with local organisations is really quite key. We've seen some sort of policy sort of retrofit programs in the UK, and I'm sure elsewhere, where that kind of sort of over top-down centralised design has actually, I think, been a detriment to the ability of local communities and local organisations to engage with the programmes. But I think the broader thing that our research shows that I'd reiterate is it's the importance of that local advice provision and that local support. It's sort of very lots of different points of the customer journey. I'm not overly keen on that term, but I think that's broadly how we understand it. So right at the beginning of the process, where an installation or something first starts to get talked about, having advice from that point onwards at multiple different stages. And I think it was in 2017, NEA administered the Technical Innovation Fund in the UK, where advice and support was built in from the start, and it used a number of different technologies, different combinations of technologies. And what we actually found from that is that regardless of the technology that was used, or the combination of technologies that was used, was that what tended to be the common denominator for the success of individual projects in that program was the amount of support they could provide. And we sometimes think that doing sort of multiple house visits and multiple contact points can sometimes be a little bit off-putting for households. It can sort of lead to a little bit of alienation. We actually found the opposite, in that it was actually, it cemented information in households' minds. It's not a very good way of putting that, but about how to use their systems correctly, who to call if they needed any further help or advice, and all of those things that made that whole process a lot smoother. So I think it's linking it back to disruption. Disruption doesn't just happen on the day of an install. It can be worry prior to it. It can be, I'm not sure what's going to happen with this. It can be afterwards, when energy bills start changing and different household routines around the heating system start changing. So it's that whole kind of, we call it wraparound quite a lot, that whole system of support and advice that kind of wraps around the entire installation process. And if you ask what's the one key thing, I'd probably argue it would be that.
Yeah, great. C?
Yeah, totally agree with Matthew's point, and also to go into the next question about how you accommodate cultural factors. There is a connection there, and that is that we're not focusing enough on those middle actors who are installing the various things, and we're definitely not focusing enough on connecting them with maybe those intermediaries in the community who understand the cultural factors and the cultural barriers. And just one example of what we're trying to do in New Zealand, we have a home performance advisor training scheme for particularly those energy efficiency and clean heating, whatever, installers. And we've now rejigged that whole training to also focus on people like budget advisors in the community, public health nurses, and also actually get the energy efficiency advisors to review them, because the training is now seen through the health and housing lens and the vulnerable, household user lens, rather than just the simple, how can we get the most carbon out, or how can we get the household most energy efficient and use the least energy. And so I think, again, I keep saying the same thing, but like connecting those different behavior changes is really important, and focusing on that, and then doing those participatory field pilots so we can show that it works, and that co-creation, something, even though it's more complex and it seems to cost more, it's actually, I think it's, in the end, it's going to cost us a lot less than having a massive policy screw up like, we have seen in Australia 10 years ago. And we still have the joy of talking about it in New Zealand. Sorry.
That's hopefully Australia will live that down one day. But Richard, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to get behind the comments that have already been made on the importance of health and the fact that if you've got an energy efficient home, it's going to be warmer and healthier. But rather than just seeing it as a way of allowing people to come home to a better environment if they've been in hospital, and the savings that you can get to health services, if we can support the agenda we've got in the UK around social prescribing, and the ethos of prevention being better than cure, so that we're stopping these things happening before they start. People aren't taking up hospital beds, they're not getting ill. At the moment, our social prescribing agenda, as far as I've seen it, has been fairly focused at the end of better physical activity and exercise and some cultural stuff, all of which is important. But if we can get the importance of warm, healthy homes on that social prescribing agenda, it would be a really big step forward, because then you can potentially start bringing together multiple sources of funding, multiple inputs from different parts of the local community to really stop the problems before they start.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a critical step moving forward. Sorry, go.
I just want to say we've shown that again in New Zealand with the Healthy Housing Initiative, which was built on that national insulation program, which was initially just insulation, and then started incorporating and connecting all the different government departments. And the Healthy Homes Initiative is now run by the Ministry of Health, but still has all the other stakeholders involved, including the energy utilities, including the community groups. And so, this is entirely doable. And now New Zealand is a tiny country with only 5 people, and we all know each other. But I do think that, it is important to start looking at those kind of examples, because I think Richard is 100% right. That's the only way we can actually solve this.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming towards the last 15 minutes of the session, and I wondered if we could think forward to the end of the decade, to 2030, and thinking about the topic of our discussion today around decarbonisation. And if each of you could just talk for 1 or 2 minutes around, in 2030, what would successful decarbonisation at that point in time look like in the housing space? Richard?
I'm happy to. Oh, sorry. Is somebody on?
You go, Siddharth.
All right. Well, I think what it looks like, and really not just as an end goal in 2030, but all the way through, is that we build up strong political constituencies around a just transition. We just have a paper out in Current Opinions in Environmental Sustainability that argues this for solar, that you can only succeed without getting backlash, without leaving out the most sort of vulnerable groups, but also without having something kind of be a non-starter because it gets too much pushback from a dominant social imaginary. I think it can only work if you show what value it's creating to get sufficiently wide public recognition to gain legitimacy for that to be a way forward. And that's true of various kinds of retrofits, true of making more socially inclusive mechanisms to channel and see upgrades. It's true of getting renewal done by sort of operators or large companies. And I think for that, a lot of the work we need to do now and over the next decade, and really thinking in terms of infrastructure time, this is not only 2030, right? We're deciding things for 2050 as well, with these 2-3 decade long investments in various kinds of infrastructure. I think what we need to think of is, we know a lot already from research. We have engaged stakeholders doing a lot of the pushing that needs to happen. How do you get key decision makers in central government in terms of cross-sectoral coordination, so peril of things like smart homes, of being able to move towards really efficient but also sensing infrastructure? And I don't think that that it's only positives. I think there's the real risk that we create mechanisms of surveillance, data infrastructuring that are super dangerous, and that again affect the least informed, least able to decide kinds of users most, and in adverse ways. So I think the challenge is really to have a just transition in a way that allows for public legitimacy to these key concerns that I think we know, but I think we need to communicate out to the key decision makers in ways that allow them to hold those large actors accountable. I don't think we're there yet, so I think that's really the greatest challenge over the next decade.
Rachael?
I think in my view, successful will in the next 30 years or so will simply be the fact that nothing will be considered hard to decarbonise. None of our homes will be characterised as such, and that will be because of a combination of innovation and technology and policy backing in terms of looking at what is cost effective, what we consider to be cost effective. So the success is what I'm doing doesn't need to be done anymore because we've solved everything.
Also, we'll all be out of a job is what I'm hearing.
I'll be retired by then, hopefully, so. So forward
Richard?
planning.
Yeah, I had 4 things I just scribbled down. One is that in the UK, we have a statutory target on fuel poverty, which is to get all fuel poor homes to energy efficiency rating C by 2030. So I'd hope that by 2030 we'd have done that. And I think I heard a session yesterday from the government side about changing the metric and the way it's all measured to a more practical approach, which was really encouraging about monitoring the way we're making progress on that. The second thing is I'd hope that we'd have taken some of the big decisions on our forward heat strategy, and in particular, the balance between hydrogen use and electrification. And they'll probably, in my world, it'd be a sensible mix of the two across the country. We won't have ripped up all of the gas infrastructure that currently provides the heat to 85% of UK homes. We'll have found some way of making good use of hydrogen or other low carbon gases. The third thing I wrote down is that we will be much better at doing the sort of holistic stuff we've been talking about, which is not just single measure approach, but going to a home once, doing all the things that could sensibly be done to it, improving it at least a couple of energy efficiency ratings, and as Matthew keeps reminding us, supporting the householder through that process in a really good way. And then the fourth one is just coming back to, I spent too long working in government. They always come back to money. But given the costs of all this, we will still need to provide some support for people who have gas in their system, at least until 2030. In fact, I think even the Committee on Climate Change reckon that there'll be gas use in the system through to 2035. So we need to accept that as part of the cost of getting to grips with the people who are off the gas grid, who are still using oil or LPG or whatever form of heating it is they use. So some sort of pragmatic approach to making sure the people in fuel poverty are not penalised.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Matthew, do you have a few thoughts?
Yeah, I've had a little bit longer to scribble down some thoughts, thankfully. I've got 5. I think a lot of them have been covered, so I'll not sort of go into that much depth. But I think the first one, as Richard has mentioned, is really holistic delivery models that capture lots of different benefits for households at the point of the installation of a low carbon heating system. I think that's really important. I like to think by 2030 we'll have already sorted that out, and we'll be rolling that out at some kind of scale. I think the second thing is some long-term policy commitments, including long-term policy funding mechanisms, particularly around this balance between protecting fuel poor households from some of the potentially adverse impacts of decarbonisation, but also recognising the need to press on towards full decarbonisation, at least in the UK by 2050, which is the target that we've got. The third one is this principle of inclusivity by design. I think by 2030, we need to have a lot better of an idea about how we decarbonise, not only hard to decarbonise housing, but hard to reach groups or kind of hard to engage groups, or more accurately, maybe groups that are excluded from engaging with the energy market for different reasons at the moment. I think fourth is hopefully by 2030, we'll have the regulatory environment in terms of the regulation of whether it's heat and power or something different that will allow really 1 and 2, the policy commitments and the holistic delivery models to emerge and flourish. And I think the fifth one, which is something that we've not talked about too much, is we need to be improving people's incomes. So we need to link decarbonisation and link the energy agenda more widely to welfare and to work. You know, the definition of poverty as a whole is that kind of low income relative to high living costs. And we need to recognise that a lot of people, especially in the UK, but more broadly across the world, don't have enough money to pay for essential needs. So I think we need to be talking about that as part of what we'd like to see in 2030 as well.
See?
I feel like I've talked a lot tonight, and I may be a bit contrarian because it's almost midnight and I just bought a big piece of land and I'm going to build an eco village and ecosystem restoration project on it. And I'm going to go way back to old traditional methods. So yes, we need to decarbonize, but maybe we need to not just focus on those, you know, silver bullet technologies and smart technologies, and instead go more into degrowth and how we can actually, you know, not just because we need to prioritize those who are the most vulnerable and stop plugging this massive inequality gap, which we just managed to widen even more during COVID, and instead actually, you know, really start rejigging some of that neoliberal structure that we're so like tied into in our thinking. And I think that decolonizing our minds is going to be a big part of that, and that includes all of us, you know, behavior changes in the privileged middle class positions that we are, to do that as well. And I think you know, there's a lot of structural things that we need to focus on, you know, I think even more than the technology solutions. And you know, if we don't start talking about it now in 2021, there's no way by 2030 we're going to be not in a much bigger issue, you know, with the ecosystem collapse and the, you know, climate crisis that we're looking at. So, you know, I want to be really positive about it, and I definitely also want to retire with all the, you know, problems being solved, like Rock here. But I do think that we need to just, you know, call a spade a freaking shovel and start, as the Australians say, and start, you know, actually focusing on the structural underlying issues of why there is such inequity and energy injustice. So, sorry again.
No need to apologise. I think that's some really interesting forward thinking there, you know, about what might be playing out and what we might need to be doing. And I don't really think I have much to add other than, yeah, I think that future really needs to be centred around the idea of degrowth, particularly in places that have been over-consuming. And, you know, COVID, I think, has allowed us, or should allow us, to rethink some of the priorities around our housing and what it means, but also, you know, what you can actually achieve within your housing. So on that note, with only a minute or two to go in the session, I think I'm going to draw this to a close. I want to thank all the panelists for a really interesting discussion and some really good discussion, I guess, across all the different presentations that people had there and linking in of key ideas. So if participants haven't yet watched the videos of the panelists, I encourage you to go back and listen to some more of the detail, because some really interesting ideas, I think, came out of those. Otherwise, thanks for joining, and hopefully everyone found it useful.
Yeah. Is it okay to slide in the last word?
Go.
Yeah, I'm inspired by Sia's point. I just wanted to say, apart from apologies for the moving visuals behind me, I'm heading to Rottmann Solar Punk Academy in sort of out in the regions in central Norway, and it's really a place where it's an artistic collaborative trying to create some of the sorts of things we've been talking about, to not only make this an LE-driven thing, but look at this post-industrial context of a few thousand people living surrounded by mountains. And I think that's also part of what we have to address. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a great conversation to be part of.
Right.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Very enjoyable. Good night.